Tom McEllinny. I am a docent at Reinhardt University at the Funk Heritage Center of the Southeastern Indians. From the time I was about 7 years old, I always was fascinated by the Indian that I saw in all the movies. And I always felt that the Indians got the end of a raw deal. And that stimulated my interest. And of course, it lay dormant for many years. And then when I retired, I had plenty of time. So I started reading and traveling and reading. And so I've made many trips and have, I don't know how many books. My wife she'd like to throw them all out. I must have 60 or 70 books on the American Indian. Most interesting thing is the fact that these particular people in that ancient culture have somehow managed to survive even today. And it doesn't matter whether they are Plains Indians or the Pueblo people in Arizona, they have all adapted to what they had to. The great irony of it is there would be a lot more of them than there are had it not been for the diseases we talked about earlier.
I know that still didn't work. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's August Lunch and Learn. We're glad to have you out this afternoon to join us for a very interesting conversation with Tom. Before we get started, let me give a couple of upcoming announcements. Our next Lunch and Learn will be next month on September 18th. That's the third Wednesday of September. Tom DeFeo will be here. Tom is a researcher and historian and writer who primarily focuses on railroad history. He's going to be here to talk about the W&A Railroad, specifically some Cartersville stories of our portion of the W&A Railroad. And then on September 26th, we're going to have our evening lecture for September, and we're going to open up a new exhibit that night, which, let me back up a second and say, if you haven't seen our camera exhibit, that closes in a week and a half. So check that out while you're here today. So once that closes, we'll take it down and we're going to open a new exhibit on fiber arts. And we're partnering with the Peachtree Hand Spinners and the Etowah Valley Hand Spinners. And they've got a great collection of materials that they have loaned us for this exhibit. So I encourage you to come out and check that out. And then on September 21st, it's a Saturday, we're doing our annual cemetery preservation workshop out at the U Harley Presbyterian Cemetery. So I encourage you, if you're interested in learn more about Cherokee, that's coming later, cemetery preservation, check that out as well. All the ticket information are on our website. Those tickets do typically sell fast, so if you're interested, I encourage you to check that out today in the next few days. All right, well, without further ado, we'll get started. Let me introduce our speaker. Tom McEllinny has been a docent at the Funk Heritage Center for over 11 years. He has completed college coursework in both archaeology and anthropology and has studied the history of American Indians, focusing on the southern tribes. Following his passion, he has visited numerous archaeological sites in Georgia and throughout the nation. Please join me in welcoming Tom McEllinny.
Thank you. It's good to be here. At my age, it's good to be anywhere. Now, I'm very old-fashioned. You're not going to see any whoop-de-doo kind of electronic shows. It's just me and a lot of maps. See, I'm a map freak. I love maps. So I want to talk off the map. So I'm going to pass this around. This is one of four you're going to get. So I'm going to pass this around, and you all can have a copy of that. Take a look at that. In this part of the country, of course, we talk a lot about the Cherokee for obvious reasons. This was their homeland before they left. But where did they come from? And one of the most unusual things about the Cherokee people is they don't speak the same language as any other tribe in the entire South. They speak a language called Iroquoian. Iroquoian is a language that is rooted in upstate New York. So they're the only tribe that speaks this language. In fact, one of the words for Cherokee actually came from the Creek people, who said they called them people of a different language because they talk differently. And the two languages, Muskogean is what the Creek people spoke. And of course, the Creek were here a long time in Georgia, long before the Cherokee ever came here. They speak a language called Muskogean. And I want to clear one thing up. There is no such thing as a Creek tribe. Doesn't exist. Never has existed. There is a federation of tribes that have lumped into this category called Creek. But if you go to any Indian who is part of the Muskogee Nation, which is what way they usually describe themselves, they would never say, I'm part of the Creek. They would take, I'm the Ogeechee Muskogee. So they would attach that, the tribal, to Muskogee. So there is no Creek tribe. Now, why do we have this term Creek then? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it does. Because when the British came here, and of course first we had the Spanish, then we had the French, and then we had the British. And when the British came here, every time they saw an Indian village, where was it? On a creek or river, right? So they said, oh, these are Creek Indians. That's how it got started. So no good reason for the term, but that's how it got started. So we're still calling them the Creek Indians, and most people today, they still about the Creek. Well, there really isn't a Creek tribe, but it's all right. It's kind of like the time I met one of the Cherokee, really I think one of the brightest guys in the Cherokee Nation, lives up in Cherokee, North Carolina, comes down and visits our museum once or twice a year. And we got the discussion about Native Americans. Everybody used the term Native Americans. Or we used to just say Indians. So I asked him, I said, explain, what do you think? What's your attitude about that? He said, it doesn't bother us, but it doesn't indicate anything either. I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, were you born here in America? I said, yes. Then you're a Native American, aren't you? Anyone born in this country is a Native American, regardless of what your roots are. Native American. I could say I'm Irish American. Someone else could say I'm French American. But he said preferably we would prefer that you refer to us as a member of the tribe we belong in. He's a Cherokee, he's a Navajo, he's an Apache. That's the preferred term. But he said we don't get mad about it, but he said the truth of the matter is Native American doesn't mean anything as far as the Indians are concerned, because you're all Native Americans. So let me talk a little bit about the map I gave you. And if you take a look at that, that's primarily the east coast of the United States. And you can see up there on the top, you'll see the Iroquois Nation. And down below, you'll find many different tribes. But down below, you'll see the Cherokee. It's a long way from upstate New York all the way down here to the south. But the migratory pattern of the tribes, and we've traced this back, is that probably the Cherokee came from the area south of the Great Lakes. You have Ontario and Lake Erie. They were all from the Ontario Lake area. And gradually, over hundreds and thousands of years, literally, people migrated. And when they migrated, they kept the same language, though. And so the further they came down, they kept the language and kept the language and kept the language. So the language is very old. Iroquois language is probably thousands of years old. They're still speaking it, but they came from that region, primarily from that. And why did they come? Well, the Cherokee were very hostile people. And if they liked you, it was good. And if they didn't, you were in real serious trouble. And they warred a lot with the other tribes around them. Did a lot of warring with other tribes. And some of those tribes eventually felt they got to get away from these guys, and they started moving south. So if you took a line and drew it from upstate New York all the way down here, over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, that migration continued. Now, they haven't migrated from there probably in the last 300 years, because the migration is long over. But that's where they came from. The Iroquois people and the Cherokee have a great deal in common. One of the things they have is their food. Food, clothing, and shelter. Everybody has to have those three things. The Cherokee diet was corn, beans, squash, bear meat, deer meat, wild turkey, and fish. The Iroquois diet was corn, beans, and squash, bear, deer, beavers, rabbits, turkey, ducks, and fish. Very similar. Well, it makes sense. Wherever you live, whatever the wildlife is, that's what you will tend to develop. But you can see they're very similar diet. Also, both of these tribes were farmers, which is interesting because we tend to think of most Indians were hunter-gatherer cultures. And even some of the later tribes like the Sioux Nation out there, they're still pretty much kind of hunter-gatherer kind of people. They're nomadic and move around a lot. These people didn't. They stayed in one place and they learned how to grow crops. So that's point number 2. Number 1, the food is the same. Clothing. How do they dress? Deerskin clothing. They all wore deerskin clothing. That was the primary material used. So the deer actually, for these people, really fulfilled 2 of the 3 things you need to live on. Food, clothing, and shelter. The deer gave you food and clothing. And basically, very simple kind of clothing. The men basically wore breechcloths and leggings, particularly leggings when they were in the woods, so they didn't get all carved up from the brambles. And both of them, the same thing. Deerskin, breechcloths for the men. The women wore skirts, wraparound skirts. The Cherokee women were a little more adventuresome. They wore them a little higher. Sexy Southern women, you know. And the Iroquois women wore them a little longer. But the women in the summertime, they didn't wear anything on top at all. It was a topless culture. When it got colder, they wore a poncho-like outfit. And when it got very cold, if you were an Iroquois, you would like to have a bear skin to wear. Down here, deer skin with the fur left on it. So here again, very, very similar. Shelter was different. The Iroquois live in something called a longhouse. A longhouse is built with large posts. It's anywhere between 50 and 150 feet long. And I always call it's an apartment house for Indians because many families lived in there. Now, the reason they developed that is those of you who have ever been to upstate New York in the wintertime know it's not a nice place to be. It's really cold, and it stays that way a long time. So these people said, we have to find a way that we can have a way to cook our food inside, not outside, because you can't go outside, it's too cold. So they needed a big building to do that. They also liked the idea of having some social life in the wintertime. You know, if you just lived in one little house to yourself, or most of the East Coast Indians, by the way, lived in something called a wigwam. If you were in the wigwam with your family, you might be in there for weeks on end. You know, you start climbing a wall, right? So this way, you could have a social life. Because in that building, it would be partitioned off, and there may be 8, 10, 20 families living there. And you could visit with them. And you had fires in the building. Because the building is so large, you could build a fire in the middle of it, punch a hole in the roof, get the smoke out, and everybody stayed warm. Not a bad idea. So that's why they developed the longhouse. Climate and geography determines almost everything the Indian cultures do in the United States, no matter where you go. It's always climate, and geography. And they're very good at adapting to those particular limitations, because they are. So here again, the Cherokee, on the other hand, they did not use that. They built what we call wattle and daub houses. Wattle and daub means sticks and mud, and most of them were round. Eventually they squared them off, but in the early days they were rounded. But here again, down here, wasn't as much of a problem because we don't have the kind of bad winters you have up north. So that was okay. So every Indian family had their own little house. And it would probably be like a circular house, maybe 12 or 14 feet across. And usually the sides were all mud and sticks, and the roof would be thatch. So their houses were very different. But here's the thing. Down here, the thatched roof house was a good idea. Everybody could have their own home, right? Up north, not a good idea. The weather's not going to cooperate. So you see, climate and geography always determines how people live. So that's the one big difference. The housing was considerably different. Organization, tribe. Cherokee was a tribe unto itself. The Iroquois was not a tribe the way we normally think of it. It was 5 Indian tribes that came together to form what they called the Iroquois Federation. But they would identify themselves as Iroquois. But they were Seneca, Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida. These were all the tribes that belonged to it. Now, how did this happen? Well, I told you they were warlike. And if you had these tribes, and I'm going to give you this will help explain a little better too. Pass this one around. And there we go. This one shows you the entire East Coast, but it breaks it into the tribal groupings better than the early one I gave you. And if you take a look at that, the Iroquois up on the north, the green spot up north there, they were somewhat warlike. And because they were 5 distinct different tribes, those tribes would fight with each other. And they'd fight with other tribes too. For instance, the Iroquois fought with the Huron. A lot of war going on. Well, a wise man by the name of Hiawatha, who himself was an Onondaga tribe member, said, too much war. Too much war. We should stop this war. There must be a better way. And he had a man who he called the prophet. And they came up with the idea of forming a confederation. And instead of fighting each other in battle, you could fight them in court. You could fight them on the council member. And they developed the first democratic document and form of government in America. This is the Constitution of the Iroquois Nation. So they would refer to themselves, I might be a Seneca, but I'm part of the Iroquois Nation. 130 articles of law. Now this was done in the late or early 1600s. This is amazing. In fact, this fascinated our founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin particularly. He was really interested in the Indians. He really got into the Indian thing. And he studied how they developed this system of law. It's a pretty sophisticated system. And he said, this is the kind of system we should develop for this country. The Iroquois Constitution was the start of the American Constitution. 1600. And it worked, by the way. They did abide by the rules. They did stop fighting. In fact, they got downright civil. If you had a council meeting and you had a beef, okay, I'm going to complain about something I don't like. No one would ever challenge you or the right for you to say that. It was considered very rude to not let someone say their piece. God, hey guys, how about Congress? Boy, they need this. They need this law bad. I mean, they need it really bad. But that's true. It was very civilized. So this is the basis of our Constitution today. That's where it started. And Washington and Franklin, they all were aware. They had a lot, by the way, the founding fathers had a lot of exposure to the Iroquois. Because bear in mind, the country at that time was headquartered in Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia is not too far from the Iroquois Nation. And so they had constant contact with them. And of course, Washington was primarily concerned. He was trying to do the best he could to keep them from going to war because they were a big group. The Iroquois Nation was over 20,000 Indians. You got 20,000 Indians mad at you, it's not a good thing. Not a good thing. So he kind of pandered to them a little bit, but they would come and they wanted to talk to the Great Father, right? He never turned them down. He probably had a visit with an Indian chief probably almost once a week. That's how much contact there is. So the founding fathers got to know this tribe pretty well. But it was the one tribe that worried them because of the sheer size of it. Most of the other tribes are much smaller, a few thousand people. But this was a big one, and it was right on their back door. So let's do what we can to keep them happy. By the way, both Washington and Jefferson came to the conclusion that the white man and the Indian could never live together successfully. So even though they tried to balance, be gentle with them, they knew that this sooner or later they was going to have to do something. And of course, Andrew Jackson came along and he did something. He sure did. But that shows you how they were. Now, the Cherokee Nation also has a written constitution, but it was done later. They did this in 1820. They wrote their own constitution. What they did was take the Constitution of the United States and adapt it to their constitutions. So isn't it interesting? We started out with the Indians developing a constitution, and then the country developed a constitution, and then the Cherokee tribe developed the constitution for themselves, like this. And for those of you that know history, when the Georgian Assembly heard about this, they were uproar. They were just completely crazy. How dare these Indians steal our Constitution? That just made him madder and made them want to get him out of the state faster. So go figure, huh? Anyhow, that's what we can tell you about that. Other similarities. One was a tribe, the other one was a confederation, so that's a different. Government pretty much followed the U.S. Constitution, just as we talk about. More important thing, common between both Iroquois and Cherokee. Matrilineal society. They were both matrilineal society. Matrilineal meaning you trace your heritage through the mother, not the father. And on top of that, and because of that, the women became more important. If you wanted to be the chief of the tribe, you better be nice to the ladies. Because you know who elected you? The tribal council. What was the tribal council? Usually 50-50 male-female. Okay? They were powerful. These women had power. Now, they also worked harder than anybody else, You know, men had it made in the South here. Let's go deer hunting. Go out and take your bow and arrow, kill a deer or two, bring it home. Got it, lay it in front of the woman and say, okay, there it is, honey, here's our clothes. And her meal. She would then have to skin the animal, tan the hides, and make the clothes from that. Men were busy out hunting some more deer. Pretty good life. So they worked very hard. They were also the gardeners. Most of the Indian gardeners, of course, we talked about corn was a very important, corns and beans and squash. Well, somebody had to plant that and somebody had to care for it, right? Guess who did that? The women. The men would help them plant it usually, but that was it. We're done. So, and because of that, the women also owned everything. They owned the houses, the clothes, the children. They owned everything. Hey, ladies, you like power? You had it. You had it. They were very powerful people. And you didn't mess with the ladies. And they had divorce, by the way. If you didn't like your husband, you took everything you had in your house and throw it out the door. And when he comes home and finds it, he knows. He's done. True story. So here again, you see the commonality between these two nations. They were both matrilineal. And not all Indian tribes are that way, but they were. So now we've got a language that's the same. We have marital relationship that is the same. So you see how close this is? And you can't do that with all the tribes in America because it ain't that so way in a lot of tribes. So that's what got me excited about this. I'm giving these tours to kids, telling them all the time about the Iroquois language. That the Cherokee spoke the Iroquois language. And the more I got thinking about, well, how'd that happen? Why? Why are they the only tribe in the South? They're 1,000 miles from New York. Why are they the only ones that speak this language? Well, that's the connection. And we think probably the migration of what became the Cherokee tribe was probably about 4,000 years ago. So a very gradual kind of thing. But there's no doubt where they came from. They came from upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and moved on down, and finally became their own entity called the Cherokee people. Now, I'll give you an idea. There's, if you take a look at some of the maps, you'll see they'll show you just where the Iroquois tribe was, or they'll show you where the Cherokee tribe was. But both these tribes were very powerful. In the north, the Iroquois were without a doubt the most powerful Indian tribe in the Northeast, no doubt. In the south, who was the most powerful and largest tribe? The Cherokee. Incidentally, about that time, they both had about 20 to 30,000 people in each tribe. No other Indian tribes in the area, any of those areas, even came close to that in total numbers. There's so many Indian tribes, there were 3,000, 4,000. Cherokee in the south, most powerful, biggest, most powerful. In the north, Iroquois, biggest, most powerful. Another similarity. I'm going to show these two. Let's do two at one time here. This one shows you the influence of the areas that were influenced by these two tribes. So even though wherever the tribal headquarters was, in the case of the Iroquois, it was in Onondaga, New York, on Lake Ontario, but the influence of that tribe and that whole area went out literally hundreds of miles. And after they developed the Iroquois nation, the other tribes, they weren't going to take these guys on. So their influence grew. And because of that, the other tribe will show you where the different states that they really had an influence on. For instance, we don't think much of the Cherokee in Kentucky. Cherokee were very big in Kentucky. But we don't think of that because, we're down here in the South, Etowah, capital at one time. And so we don't think of that. But truth is that the influence emanating from where these tribes are headquartered was tremendous and made them even more powerful. So once again, very, very similar. You take a look, multiple states that the Cherokee operated in and multiple states that the Iroquois operated in and influenced. Okay, culture physical. How about the physical features? Well, one of my favorite authors is a guy by the name of John Bartow. He was an eyewitness to the South, lived with the Southern Indians for several years. I would highly recommend this book to you because it's one of the few eyewitnesses we have of what the Indians in the South were like right before the Revolutionary War. And he's also an interesting writer. He's a little flowery at times, but that was don't forget that this was 1760. The language is a little different then. But that's, I think, is because it is an eyewitness account. And he was very objective, too. He did not have any, preconceived notions about the Indians in terms of being good or bad. He actually was he was a botanist. Came down here to the South to learn plants. Well, he got into the plants all right, and he would actually ship some of those back to the north, to Philadelphia, where his father lived, and his father was a botanist also. And what he found out is the Indians were more interested in the plants. So he spent a lot of time with all these different tribes. So he will tell you the difference between the Cherokee people and the Seminole people and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, because he lived with all of them. And in that period, we have no other account of someone who actually lived with these people for an extended period of time of almost every major tribe in the South. So that's why I like the book. Now, if you're really a nut on this stuff, you have to have Swanton, the Southeastern Indians. It's 600 pages long. I have never read it. I've read pieces of it. It's a wonderful reference tool.
What is the name of that book?
This is called William Bartram on the Southeastern Indians. He wrote a couple other books too, but this is the more famous of the two. But he will give you a good picture of that. He did not have that much exposure, though, with the Iroquois. He was primarily down in the South, and even though he came from Philadelphia, he was out of there a long time, so he didn't really have that much. The religion, what about religion? They both believe in the great creator. Both of these tribes, great creator. Great creator made the world, gave us the world to use. That's why the Indians have a hard time. They don't believe that any man should own any land. The land is the great creator's land. You're just allowed to live on it. And of course, when the British came, they could never get their heads around that because the British law is all built on property, ownership. And they just could not figure that out. And the Indians couldn't figure them out because they said, you can't own the land. The creator owns the land. You can't own the land. You can't sell the land. Can you sell the air? Totally different philosophies. Totally different. But so from a religion standpoint, very much the same. Great creator. Traders, they did a lot of trading. The trade good in the South, as you probably know, was the deerskin. That's what the British wanted really bad, and they would be happy to trade you all those wonderful axes and pots and things that the Indians didn't have for those hides. In fact, they priced everything in hides. You've heard the expression, somebody says, that costs $4, $2, $3, buck skin. That's where that expression came from. And these old English traders, they were really good capitalists, man. They figured out, these Indians are smart. They're going to try and play us off each other. You know that? Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to set a price. And regardless of which English trader you went to buy that axe, it was going to be 3 skins. pretty smart. But the Indians, of course, they wanted those things. And most of all, they wanted guns. And the price of a gun, by the way, as established by the British traders, 30 skins. Can you imagine how long it would take you with a bow and arrow to go out and kill 30 deer, bring the deer back, skin the deer, tan the hide? Probably about a 3-year proposition. They did it because they wanted the gun. That was the most expensive item. More often than not, they were looking at more simple things like pots and axes and things like that, which, of course, they had none of that because they were Stone Age people. So those tools are wonderful for them. But they traded with the English. The Iroquois traded also, but the Iroquois started trading with the Dutch because the Dutch were in New York before the English came. And then when the English came, then they started trading with the English. But the English then wanted something different. They wanted beaver hides. We got a lot of beavers up there in the North Country. Well, they wanted them a lot. And what actually happened is they almost wiped out the beaver population. Same thing in the South. More deer, more skin, more deer, more pots, okay? We almost wiped out the deer population. Now, I'm pleased to report that today there are more deer in the United States than there have been in 50 years. And a large portion of them are in my yard every morning eating all my azalea bushes. And I'm getting to resent deer. But so we haven't wiped out the deer, but there was at one time. And it's interesting if you take a look at history overall. Think about the Plains Indians and the buffalo. The buffalo was to them what the deer was to the Southern Indians. Food and clothing. And for them it was shelter, because guess what a teepee's made out of? Buffalo hide. Food, clothing, and shelter from one animal. Did the same thing out there. One time there were 60 million buffalo on the plains. Well, it got to be such fun games to kill buffalo that it got down to about 100,000. That's how they almost completely wiped out that species. Ted Turner's trying to bring them back. Thank you, Ted. He's got a bunch of, Steve was the first guy that actually started to put buffalo on his ranches out there and, let them go. But it's the same kind of thing. Almost wiped out the beaver, almost wiped out the deer, and almost wiped out the buffalo. All this for greed. More. So here again, very similar. Same kind of trading practices. We talked about the power of women, and in both cases, the women did elect the chiefs. So both the Iroquois and Cherokee, same election process. Farmers, both were farmers. Both the Iroquois and the Cherokee farmed their land. Corn, beans, and squash. Even that far north was up there. Corn, by the way, came from Mexico originally and worked its way all the way up to Minnesota over hundreds of years. But that's where it came from. But corn is the truly North American vegetable. It was found nowhere else on earth, just here. And it was the basis of the diet for those people. Geography of both areas is very similar. If you go upstate New York and nobody told you where, you might think you're still in Georgia. Kind of hilly, lakes, very similar to where we are right now. Like Lake Allatoona, you drive up there, same kind of geography. So both these people had the same kind of geography. They're called the woodland Indians, mainly because they lived largely in wooded areas, all up and down the East Coast. Not just here, but all the way from Georgia to New York. These are all woodland type cultures. And the forest is a big part of their life. So another commonality between the two people. we already talked about the Constitution thing, so we don't need to go into that, but you can see how many similarities there were between these two groups. Language, law, all of these things, very, very similar. Very, very similar. And today, of course, the Cherokee are still speaking Iroquois. They're trying to keep it alive. It's very difficult to keep these Indian languages alive. The younger generation is not as interested in them, and it's really tough to keep them going. But the Indian man I talked to you about earlier, about the Native American thing, he teaches in the Cherokee High School in Cherokee, North Carolina. And he teaches the language, among other things. He teaches more than one thing, but he teaches the Iroquois language because they're trying to keep that alive. Now, the Iroquois and the Cherokee, in terms of size of tribe, the Cherokee Nation is considerably bigger today than the Iroquois. The Iroquois, and I look at all this stuff, and everybody's got these wacko numbers. They don't agree with it, and you have to go back and look at what's the basis of those numbers. For instance, if you want to establish yourself as a Cherokee, you have to be able to document it from a document called the Dawes Papers. Dawes Papers were when the Indians were run off, that was all recorded. If you can trace one of your family back in that Dawes paper, you're a member of the Cherokee tribe. Some tribes are less, they all have different rules. Some you have to document 1/8 Indian, 1/4 Indian. Everyone's different. So when they start giving statistics, what are you counting? Are you counting the people who said they're Cherokees or people who have documented that they're Cherokee? What is it? And it ranges all over the place. All over the place. I'll give you some numbers here. This supposedly is from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Economics and Statistics Administration. That scares me right there. This is according to their numbers. The Cherokee Nation across all the country, 819,000 Cherokee. Next one is the Navajo, 332,000. Then the Choctaw, 195,000. The Iroquois here is only 81,000. But from other numbers I've looked at, see, one of the problems with is if you self-identify yourself as being part Cherokee, you can be counted in these numbers, even though you may not really be your heritage. So that's where the numbers get really squirrely. The ones I've relied on more is that the Cherokee and the Navajo both are about 300,000 people all over the country, of course. The Navajo is more concentrated in the Southwest. The Cherokee are all over the country now. In fact, the biggest contingent of Cherokee people with Cherokee heritage, is in, of all places, California. There's more Cherokee in California than any other state in the Union. Well, that was the root of it right there. When the Indians were relocated, where did we put them? In Oklahoma, right? You ever heard of a Dust Bowl? Guess what happened when Dust Bowl came? All those good Indian farmers, they couldn't make a living. So just like the white farmers in Oklahoma, they packed up and went west. That's how that happened. It's, because they were impacted just like the whites. Everybody was migrating out of there. Couldn't live there anymore. So that's why there's a big contingent out there, Cherokee people. And the Iroquois, on the other hand, basically they still have a very large group that live in upstate New York, but they have reservations up there. In the state of Georgia, we have no reservations. We had two pretty big tribal groups here, the Cherokee and the Creek or Muskogee. These are big groups. Georgia didn't want no part of reservations for Indians. Get them out of here. So we don't have any reservations. But in upstate New York, they have several reservations up there for the Iroquois people. So they've clustered. They're still together where the Cherokee have, just scattered all over now. But that's one of the reasons. That's why, of course, some of these numbers I'm not. I buy more of the other set of numbers that I use, which is around 300,000, more realistic. And of course, the thing that wiped out all these Indian tribes wasn't war. They died from diseases brought here by the European settlers. And they died in incredible numbers. I'll give you a case in point. Lewis and Clark, you might have heard of those two fellows. Well, in their journeys, they spent 6 months living with a tribe up in Minnesota called the Mandan tribe, which is still around. Mandan tribe, when Lewis and Clark first went there, was about 8,000. Well, then the Mandan started trading with the French, who right down Mississippi River, French, that's where they were. So they started trading. Well, the more they traded, the more the French came and brought these diseases that they had no immunity for. Smallpox, influenza, they had no immunity. Now, those diseases did not kill the Europeans because they had immunity. They might get sick, and yes, some of them died, but not en masse. The Mandan tribe of 8,000 within 2 years went to 400 people. That's 95% mortality rate. What culture can stand that? They can't. That's what wiped out the Indian population in the United States. And the Northeast was the same way. A lot of the Iroquois, a lot of them died from smallpox was the big killer. A lot of them died from that. In fact, what the Iroquois would do, if they went with war, if they captured somebody in an Indian war of another tribe, they'd adopt them. Because they had to build the tribe back up. They lost all these people, died. So, at any rate, but today, my judgment from this number and a bunch of other ones we've looked at, the Cherokee and Navajo are very close, somewhere around 300,000 each. And then it drops off from there, goes down pretty far. The Sioux Nation, for instance, out in the plains, 170,000. That's probably realistic. Iroquois at 81. I think there's a little more. I think that one understates. But these are the top 25 tribes. And the smallest tribe is the Alaskan Athabascan. So we don't think about the Alaska, but they're Indians. And by the way, they have the highest concentration of an Indian population of any state in America, is Alaska. So at any rate, this gives you a picture of the country. So even today, these are two of the most powerful tribes in America. The Cherokee and the Iroquois today are still the most powerful tribes in our country. Okay, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So while women were doing all that stuff, what would the men do?
What would the men do?
Like while they're tanning the hides and making the food.
Oh, they're playing stickball, having a big time.
Sounds
Yeah, men had it made. Men had this made.
Alright.
Now, bear in mind, you were the woman. You owned everything.
dang straight.
The man owned nothing. Okay,
That's nice.
and you elect the chiefs. So it's a trade-off. No doubt, the Indian women worked much harder than the Indian men did. But the point is, they also were more powerful.
Well,
They controlled a lot of what went on in that tribe. Yes.
So if they're doing all that, and I'm assuming the kids would help them with some of their chores, because what would the kids be doing with the women are doing all that stuff?
Well, the kids, were allowed to be kids to some degree.
Yeah, sure.
By the way, usually if it was a boy, he was really raised not by his father, but by his uncle.
Okay.
And the uncle would teach him all the things you needed to know, how to make an arrow, how to make a bow, all of that kind of thing. He would be taught by his wife's brother.
Okay.
Why that arrangement? Why not dad?
I don't know. Good question.
too involved, maybe too personal?
That's a very good question, and I have never found the answer to that question.
Still kept.
Because you got to say, well, why not? Why not Dad? Now I can understand the matrilineal thing because there can never be a question about whether a child's who his mother is, but there can always be a question of who her father is, right? That's part of why I think they had the matrilineal system. You always knew who the mother was. You weren't always sure who the father was. But that's a good question, but I can't answer it. I haven't found any answer to it. So
Well,
some things we don't
As a
know.
teacher, I know the more removed you are from the child, sometimes the better teacher you are. You're more objective. Because,
Yeah.
a parent trying to teach a young child who's struggling is already worried about, will my child be able to go to college? And this is a 6-year-old. But as a teacher, that was the last thing in my mind. I wasn't that personally
That's right.
involved.
And see, the uncles would be the same way.
Right.
They would not be that personally
Personal.
involved.
Right.
So that's why they did it that way, I guess.
So they could, just a euphemism, sort of let go at the back of the bike, let the kid
Yeah,
go
let him
off
go.
on
That's
his own.
right. That's right.
Take a risk,
Yeah.
whereas Dad, might be a little more nervous
be.
about that.
Could be. That's a good question. But I don't have a real good answer for you. I'm sorry. Yes.
Since it goes back to the mother's brother,
Yeah.
the mother has a little more control over the brother too. I know my mom used to tell me that most moms don't quit being moms, but dads frequently quit being dads.
True.
So there's a little bit more direct connection.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Now, the women-
Anything to do with
The women children, they would be educated by their mothers. That's the difference. So their mother would teach them everything they need to know. But the boys, not so.
I have another question.
Yes.
You talked about the Iroquois and the Cherokee being the most powerful tribes today.
Yes.
What is their superpower? Powerful in what way? Are they represented in Congress? Are they?
Yes.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. You can go to. First of all, the Indians are vastly understaffed in terms of the Congress.
Right.
There probably should be more than there are, but they do have some sway there. So there are a few of these people that actually have become legislators. And my favorite Indian leader of the Cherokee was a woman, Wilma Mankiller. No joke, that's her name, Wilma Mankiller. And I remember I was on a business trip in Oklahoma, and I was riding around the state, and I see this sign. It says, Principal Chief, Wilma Mankiller. I said, man, I got to get out of here. Yes, sir.
I grew up in New York State.
Oh, did you?
Yes, and I would appreciate this talk. I remember learning lists a lot in grade school and middle school, but have you heard of wampum?
Oh, yeah.
That was a currency? It was shells? Did that come down here?
That did not quite make it down here. But the wampum thing was like a token gift that you would give if you had signed an agreement with someone to more legalize that or more formalize it. You would give them a wampum belt. And the wampum belt had different symbols on it. It was all made with beading. And that's really what it was more about. And that particular thing, the Iroquois do not have anything quite like that. That's kind of unique to primarily the Northeast, not just the Iroquois, but Indians in that area. Wampum belt is what it was. But that's what it was, mainly a way of formalizing an agreement.
Since the Cherokee and the Iroquois are related, do they have any connections today, for instance? Where
Not much.
They speak the language?
Well, they speak the same language, but the two tribes operate independently of each other. I'm sure they get together from time to time. The Cherokee also have an interesting situation in that they are broken into two groups. You have the Cherokee Nation, Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and then you have the Eastern Band of the Cherokee in Cherokee, North Carolina. And the Eastern Band, they're kind of an independent group. They still go to Tahlequah for meetings and things, but they have sort of a little bit their own little bit thing up there. But the Iroquois don't have anything like that.
And the Constitution that the Iroquois, 1600, how was that, since they didn't have an alphabet? So how did they maintain that? How did they just...
Memory.
Memorization?
The chief elders in that tribe would memorize the rules, and they would pass that on to generation, which is unbelievable that they did it. Other cultures have done the same thing, by the way. It's not just unique to them. Where the only way they had a recording is the elder would remember things and say those things and tell the kids that. And that's how they maintained their history. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine memorize. That thing is 30 pages long. And it's very detailed. That's the amazing part of it. It tells, if one man steals from another man, and it will go through the whole process of what rule of law has to decide that. It's not superficial. It's very precise. And to think these savages back in 1600 came up with this is amazing. And that's what, by the way, that's what fascinated Ben Franklin. He said, if these savages can form a governmental system that works, and it was working, why shouldn't we be able to take 13 colonies and do the same thing? There's the tie. So where'd you get the idea? From the Cherokee Constitution. But it's very detailed. I have not read the entire Iroquois Constitution, but I pick out things from time to time, and it always amazes me. Whatever I pick out, they are very precise. It's far more precise than our Constitution, quite frankly. There's not as much room for interpretation. It's spelled out. If you do this, this is the punishment. Very precise.
There's one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
Funk Heritage Center. Can you tell us a little bit about that, your connection, and how the Heritage Center is promoting these kinds of
The
discourse?
Funk Heritage Center is a adjunct to the university, Reinhardt University. Sits right on the edge of the Reinhardt campus, and our museum is right on the edge. And we also have a pioneer settlement off to the size. We have about 50 acres altogether. Most of the building is on the front part, and the back part is all the settlement. Settlement has a 1840 log cabin, a blacksmith shop, a sorghum mill, all that kind of stuff. So we take the kids down there. Our main goal and our main objective is to help educate primarily grade school kids. And October, November, we're busy as all get out. Dies off in December. And then February, March, and April, we're gangbusters. We did about 8,000 kids last year. So that's our main function. But it's a very unique thing, and it was started by a man by the name of James Funk, who was the orthopedic surgeon and the first team doctor for the Atlanta Falcons. And he was a graduate of Reinhardt, and he would go up and talk to these Reinhardt kids and say, these kids, they don't know anything about where they live. They have no clue. And that sort of got his head going, we're going to do something about this. Well, what he did is coughed up some money and then got some rich friends, came up with this idea, we're going to build this museum to the Southeastern Indians. That was the genesis of it, and it was built in 1999. So it's been around a few years. And you're all welcome to come. We'd love to have you. If you come as a group, we'll arrange a regular tour for you. But that's the genesis of the whole thing. And the other thing we have is we have one of the world's greatest tool collections. We have a tool room. We call it the tool room. It's a big room. 9,000 tools. And most of these were all handmade, not machine made. And they are, the way they're portrayed is based by trade. For instance, we have a watchmaker's tools, a hat maker's tools, a wheelwright's tools. It's very interesting. And you know, that's not Indian, but here's the connection. When the Indians left, settlers came in, what they needed? Tools. They had to build houses. They had to make wagons, all that kind of stuff. How'd you do that? Tools. So that's a connection. So I can take you from, in the museum, I can take you back 12,000 years ago until the present. Indian, most of that's Indian, of course. You know, only about 200 or 300 of it is really white settler stuff, but the rest of it is Indian. But that kind of gives you the genesis of how it was, how this thing got going. And it's a great little museum, you know, very interesting. So you're all welcome to come over. And it's not too far from here.
Tom, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.